Hello, my name is Annalise Newmeyer, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how the Black Panthers impacted the disability rights movement or the intersection of civil and disability rights. So to kind of begin our conversation, I want to talk to you a little bit about myself. So this is me. I was like 2 or 3 years old, and this is my family. So I am a person with a disability. I have a congenital hip issue. And then my parents also have disabilities. So, and they also worked with people with disabilities. So my mother worked at the Center for Independent Living in Toledo, Ohio, and my father was a rehab counselor for the vision impaired. And he was also legally blind. But both of them, spent their lives advocating for people with disabilities. And so the disabilities movement is very important to me and my family. And then this is, the family that I've created. So obviously my partner is Black and my son is biracial. And so civil rights movement and Black Lives Matters movement is very important to me as well, because of their rights. And then, I've been an educator since 2006. I currently work at Educare in Bronzeville. I am the only white teacher, and so it is very important for me teaching Black children and then working closely with my coworkers to make sure that their rights are also being upheld. So when I was in college, I remember Dr. Bernice King coming to speak, and she's the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, and I just remember her talking about sort of uniting. So talking about to make any progress on the civil rights front, oppressed people, whether you're being oppressed due to gender, race, religion, or disability, need to form a coalition and work towards these rights because civil rights benefit everyone. This talk was 20 years ago, but to this day, that's what I remember about it. And then we see that in our own history here in Chicago. So, a lot of people have seen the documentaries on Fred Hampton or Black Panther Party. And that was his whole, mission, was to create that rainbow coalition, Blacks, whites, Latinos uniting to make change in their communities. And then we also saw that in the disability rights movement with the historic sit-in at the federal or at the state building for Section 504. So I'm going to be talking more about that a little bit later. Section 504 really talked about discrimination, and sort of the basis of it was that no otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States shall solely on the basis of his handicap be excluded from the participation, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal assistance. So, we the 504, just to kind of give you a little information about it, we see it in our schools, right, as educators. So it kind of talks about the elements of a disability. So whether it's a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity, such as learning, it could be caring for yourself, seeing, hearing, walking, anything that would impact learning. Or I'm sorry, any sort of impairment that could impact any of these things. And so it also talked about not being discriminated based on your age. And then it made sure that schools could not deny services and that these services to students must be equal to non-disabled students' opportunities, which included academics, like throughout the school day, but also extracurricular activities. So disabilities in schools, so it did not authorize special education, but it talked about discrimination. And then it did distinguish that not all students that qualified for Section 504 do not always need an IEP. So for example, I'm a student that qualified under Section 504. And so there were times when I needed modifications to the physical environment. So for example, there were times when I had to have surgery and I would be having to use crutches. And so I would need extra time to get to classes, or I needed to use the elevator if my class was on the second floor. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about what sort of led up to the sit-in in San Francisco. So yes, Section 504 was passed. However, there were no regulations. So, judges were making decisions. They were different. There was no sweeping changes. And people were still facing discrimination. So for example, if a bus pulled up to the bus stop and there's a person with using a wheelchair waiting for the bus, they stopped, but the person couldn't get on the bus. So was that considered discrimination? Because they gave them access to the bus. Section 504 was passed under President Ford, and the disabilities movement activists were rallying. They were trying to talk to the government officials, like, you need to make these regulations. And he kind of refused to do it because he was getting a lot of pressure from businesses and government agencies because they don't want to spend the money to install ramps or make transportation accessible. And so, President Carter, he promised he would do it. He's like, I'm going to do it. He had his Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEU at that time, Califano, and they kept just saying, we're going to do it, we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And activists got more and more upset, like, no, now, we're going to give you a deadline. You have until April 5th, 1977 to create these regulations. And so, as we can tell by history, they did not do it. And so we see, a lot of us have watched Crip Camps, so we sort of know some of this history where, Ed Roberts and Judy Heumann sort of organized this rally. So protesters showed up outside the state building with like a toothbrush, and they were not prepared. They were not prepared to offer this sit-in. They didn't have food. Some of them didn't even have the medicine they needed. But that rally turned into them taking over the building and holding a month-long sit-in. And I found this quote very powerful from Judy Heumann. She said, "We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We will accept no more discussion of segregation." And someone else who, is not as prominent, that we don't know as much about, is Brad Lomax. And so Brad Lomax, he was a very interesting person. So, he was born in Alabama during the civil rights movement. So he understood racial discrimination, right? But when he moved to DC to attend Howard University, he, started falling when he was walking, and he was later diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and ended up having to use a wheelchair. And so he realized that he was also being discriminated against because of his ability. So he wasn't able to access buses, and it was hard for him to get into different buildings because there were no ramps. I mean, he talked about how his brother would have to lift him out of his wheelchair to put him on the bus. And so, he had started the Black Panthers party branch in DC. And so he used that platform to really talk to the Black Panthers, we need to do work around this because I'm being discriminated, not only because of my race, but because of my ability. And we need to support this movement. And so He ended up moving to Oakland, and while he was in Oakland, he met Ed Roberts, who started for the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. And with his support and the Black Panthers support, he founded the Center for Independent Living branch in East Oakland. And so we see during the sit-in 2 years later how this relationship between Brad Lomax and Ed Roberts proved really vital in continuing the sit-in and gaining these regulations for 504. So we've seen a lot of these images of the rally, of the protests, of the sit-in, people who are in wheelchairs are laying on the floor, and everyone kind of worked together during this protest. We see like in Crip Camp, they talk about how, the phones were cut off. And so they're like, how are we going to communicate with the outside world? And the people who are deaf are like, we've got this, like, we can do this. But Brad Lomax, because of his affiliation with the Black Panthers, called Black Panthers, he called them and said, we need food and we need supplies. And so for the entire month-long sit-in, the Black Panthers provided this. And then on top of that, the rally, people are rallying across the nation, right? But in San Francisco is where they did the sit-in, but it wasn't really gaining that much attention, but the Black Panthers really brought it to people's attention. Not only were they talking about it in their newspapers, in their party's newspapers, but they were making sure that people across the nation were paying attention to what was happening in San Francisco. And even their support continued on. So after the sit-in ended, they helped pay for Brad Lomax and other people to go to DC to actually talk to the government. And so I just think this is just such a beautiful representation of the intersectionality of supporting each other, creating that coalition, and uniting to make huge sweeping changes that still affect us today, affect us and benefit us. And I just want to briefly talk about, I would argue the most profound and important piece, law, Supreme Court case that affects public schools is the Brown versus the Board of Education. And so as we know, the Supreme Court ruled that separate learning spaces were not equal, and they ended segregation. And so this ruling has also been used to support inclusion pertaining to children with disabilities. So this is basically why we have inclusion for our students with disabilities. And then also, as educators, we need to remember that Black children are disproportionately classified more often as having a disability. They experience less inclusion and they're bullied more often. They undergo more restraint and seclusion. They are suspended and expelled more frequently and are placed more usually into the pipeline from special education to the juvenile justice system. So I just think that, it's really important for us as teachers to understand and realize that our power and influence when it comes to the rights of our students, that it's important for us to unite and to create those communities of learners. And so I just want to leave you with this. I ask and I challenge you to ask yourselves, how as an educator am I standing up and supporting my students' rights? How am I creating community in my classroom to support inclusion and accessibility for all?